So this is the fifth class in a series of 8 classes on the Genjo Koan, which is one of Dogen Zenji's most revered teachings. Some scholars, like Okumura Roshi, who is the translator of the text we're using, says that it really is the central text. He says that the two texts of Dogen Zenji, very early texts, one is the Makahanya Haramitsu, which is Dogen's presentation of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. That is his explanation of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So he's kind of using the language of the sutras and expressing that truth. And that Genjo Koan is where he uses his own words to express that same truth. And he holds those two up as being the really foundation of Dogen Zenji's teachings. And so this is probably the most studied text of Dogen Zenji. And as a result, there's lots of commentaries and lots of different things you can look at. So I always feel like I want to start out by encouraging people to recite the text a lot, get it in your body and mind and heart in a lot of different ways. And then also, as you feel inspired, to look at various commentaries and things that different people have to say about it. Of course, none of them will be as insightful as mine, but you know, there's a lot out there. And then again, always my plug at the beginning is my goal is to help you develop a relationship with this text. That's the point of teachings. It's not so that you get the meaning and then you're done. It's so that you develop a relationship with a text that can carry you forward in practice. And although this text goes into a lot of interesting places that can seem very abstract or like super out there, it's all about practice realization. It's all about the eye of awakening, which is the moment to moment endeavor of a bodhisattva in ways that we might consider very mundane. That's our delusion, to think of some things as mundane and some things as spiritual. That's not how things are. That's our delusion that thinks of them that way. And so right in the midst, though, of that delusion and that idea that parts of our life are mundane and not really very spiritual, this text guides us back to waking up to the spiritual relevance of everything about life. And that's one of the really, I would say, core signatures of Dogen Zenji's way of practicing and the lineages that spring from him, which we are one of those lineages, that the focus on caring for every aspect of life is really emphasized. Dogen Zenji very deeply affected the Japanese culture. He's he's not an obscure figure in the development of Japanese culture. He came about at a time where there was a big shift from the old schools, primarily esoteric schools of Buddhism, into a new era where Buddhism was taking on another flavor. And his deep conviction that everything was part of practice came into Japanese society and has informed so many of the things that Westerners have come to love about what comes out of Japanese society. An attention to detail, not just for detail's sake, but because paying attention to simple things is where the life comes through something. So those of you who enjoy Japanese cuisine or any of the various arts, whether those are martial arts or they're visual arts or performative arts or anything, they're all deeply marked by this heart that says everything matters. That was a big break in the tradition. If you go to monasteries outside of Japan, for example, it's very common that the monks don't do very much work. They're like sub-monks that do all the work. And the monks meditate and study. That's seen to be the spiritual work. But if you go to a Zen monastery, particularly in Japan, most monasteries now, they've been so affected by this, but Zen monasteries, particularly Soto Zen monasteries, everybody is, like washing the floors and the toilets and taking care of all the details of what seems like kind of mundane life. And so, anyway, I'm just kind of talking about that today because, again, in the way that Genjo Koan can get very kind of out there and rearranging the way that you see the world and think about things, it really is about the practical matter of moment to moment living, and what is it to see with an eye that can see the spiritual value in things, as opposed to this kind of divided mind that says, oh, these are the important things and these are the unimportant things. So that's the goal, and that's what I mean by a relationship with a text, is to develop a relationship with a text that will throw you back on that again and again and again. And then come to the temple and I'll tell you, pay attention. I'll be good. So we've been studying this text, Genjo Koan, and I've been talking about it in different ways, but one of the words I've been using a lot is invitation. So I can say that we've been studying this invitation, which is the text of the Genjo Koan, is an invitation, and it's an invitation to the invitation of life. Right? So that's one way that I've been loosely translating Genjo Koan, is that Genjo is the immediate present actuality right here. And Koan is a teaching, but I've been using the word invitation, very loose translation. But Koan is a kind of teaching story, which is an invitation into seeing things in a different way. So we're studying this invitation to the invitation of moment-to-moment living. And Dogen's central teaching that all dharmas are included in the way, because all dharmas are presently actual, they're ungraspable, and they're true. We're going to study a little bit about what that means for them to be true tonight. So one way to discuss this, Buddha way, or this invitation, which Dogen picks up in section 4, 5, 6, and 7, is about the relationship between self and things. And so the past couple classes, we've been talking a lot about that. Remember this? This was so fun last week. Goodbye, blazing mouth. We're going back to the invisible world for now. Don't think he's gone. So I've been drawing a lot of things that look like this. I was flowers one time and cats the other. I'll go back to flowers today. So saying that this is the way we think about how we perceive things, that we have, this is me. Okay. And that my consciousness then, I'm using my eyes, I see the flower, and then a flower appears in my mind. And I am a subject in a world of objects, and that's how it is that I experience things. So Dogen Zenji, in these first ones, he's taking aim at that way of thinking about it, right? The idea that we're a subject in a world of objects, and saying that from one perspective, we are a subject in a world of objects. And we call that world delusion, right? And remember, he doesn't say that that needs to be eliminated, but he says that we should recognize that that is one side of Genjo Koan. That is one side of the invitation to the actuality of life. We call it the Genjo Koan of delusion, right? The invitation of delusion. Buddhas are greatly enlightened about delusion, right? So we don't want to throw that side out. We want to come to understand it more deeply. And so he's saying that if this is deluded, carrying oneself forward to carry out practice realization, that's delusion. That all things come forward and carry out practice realization through the self. This is realization. That the fact that this was the kind of thing I was drawing last time. The fact that we can see the flower isn't because I'm a subject and the flower is an object. The reason I can see the flower is because I am receiving life from the flower and I am giving life to the flower, and that's happening together. That our mutuality is the reason that there is the perception of a flower. It's not just I'm the subject and it's the object. That the mutuality. This is very core Buddhism if we break it down in this way, right? The great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh coined the phrase interbeing, that there's no flower without me and there's no me without the flower. And that's always the case. The Buddha talked about this as dependent origination. Right? So, in section 4, we talk about that. And then in section 5, he talks about this: when one side is illuminated, the other side is dark, which we're going to talk a little bit more about that later today. But that is actually this circle that we're talking about is not a circle of two things. It's just one circle. And that circle is like a mirror, right? In that it reflects. But in this part, he says, there's no two things. There's not like a flower and then a reflection of the flower. There is just the luminosity of the mirror, or the smile of Mahakashapa, the very just direct illumination. The flower is direct illumination. And there's not two things there at all. That's what he means by one side is illuminated, the other side is dark. We don't have like two things that are going back and forth with each other. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. And then in section 6, last week we went through this quite a bit. Then he starts to talk about what is the way to do this. What is the Buddha way? So these are all a little bit explanatory, like they're not quite metaphysical, but they're a little bit talking about how things are. Now he's going to say this is a way to practice. Right? And so from 6, we start getting that more direct teaching about the way to practice. And he says, if you want to study the Buddha the way, study the self. If you want to study the self, forget the self. You want to forget the self, that's being actualized by all things, or verified. And then he says that there is this ungraspable trace of realization that unfolds from there. So that's our introduction to what it is to practice. And last week I was saying that one way we can think about this is a sequence. Like you think about starting with studying the Buddha way. I want to study the Buddha way. That's why you're all here, right? You said, I want to study the Buddha way. I'll go to class on Thursday night. So if you want to do that, he says, that's the first thing. You need to be inspired to study the Buddha way. And then you need to move on to studying the self. You can't think of the Buddha way as being out there. You have to think about it as here. And as you study the self, then you're going to see that to get to know the self, you can't think about it as being yourself. You can't think about this self that you're going to analyze. You have to forget about the self to be able to really truly study the self. And if you want to forget about the self, you have to allow all things to actualize you rather than you going out to actualize them. You have to drop off body and mind so that you can have that kind of study happening. So we talk about it in a sequential way, but another way to think about it is that they're all the same thing. Studying the Buddha way is studying the self. Studying the self is forgetting the self. Forgetting the self is being actualized by all things. Being actualized by all things, dropping off body and mind, is all things coming forward to verify the self, is all of those things. It's just different words for the same thing. Right? And that we don't have to think of an arc in practice. The reason that's important is because even if you don't intend to, you'll very naturally create a kind of ranking in your mind. Okay, the studying the self stuff, that's good for beginners, but I'm really at the stage of dropping off body and mind, right? And so I don't need to do that studying the self business. This is not what he's saying. He's saying studying the self is dropping off body and mind. And so if you're telling yourself, I'm doing this part, not that part, that's not right. Now, having said that, sometimes it feels a lot more like one than the other. Sometimes it feels just like a lot of studying the self. Stubborn, deluded, stinky mind of my own. And then sometimes your mind doesn't feel like that. Sometimes it feels like a flower. Oh, I hope sometimes it feels like a flower. So that's where we were. So let's look at 7. Because I could just talk about all that forever and then we wouldn't get any farther in the text. I promise we would get a little farther in the text. So 7 is a kind of natural extension from 6. And there's 2 paragraphs in this one. And the first one, he starts out, when a person first seeks after the Dharma, the person becomes far from the boundary of the Dharma. When the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, the person is immediately an original person. I just find this so intuitively true. And on that level, if you think about what's the difference between the place where you're searching something out that you think is outside of you, and what's the place where you're just ready to receive, that those are very different places. If we tease this out a little bit, seeking the boundary, or when we seek, the boundary becomes far. One way you can think about this is the Dharma is so intimate. Like the Buddha's truth. When the Buddha was awakened under the Bodhi tree, he said, I, the great earth, and all beings awaken at the same time. That means you. That means me. It means any being you've ever met, anything you've ever encountered is awakened together with the Buddha. So with that level of intimacy, when we start seeking the Dharma, which we need to do, it's just inevitable that the Dharma becomes very far away. Because as soon as you look past your own being, the Dharma's far away, right? Because you could look out there all day long. It's like trying to see your back, right? You can't, your back, you're totally intimate with your backside, right? I mean, you don't get to see it, you'll get to touch it, you feel it, that feels good sometimes. But you're totally intimate with it. So once you look out there for it, there's no way you can be able to see it. It goes very, very, very far away. It's only your kind of imagination that could come up with it. My teacher used to tell me, he would say, oh, the Buddha's right here on your shoulders. Can't see him. He's right here on your shoulders. It's that intimate. One time, a Laotian boy that was living in the neighborhood I was living in Portland in the early 90s, he came, there's this pack of Laotian kids that lived in our neighborhood. They were so cool. I just loved them. They would come and our oldest daughter, Anzu, was a baby, and they would take her and kind of, we'd let them take her around the neighborhood a little bit. And she was pretty small, so we kind of keep our eye on them. There was everything from the older kids were maybe like 11, 12, and then the younger kids were like maybe 6 or 7, 5 maybe, and they all kind of roam around in a pack and take care of each other. They could climb anything in flip-flops. It was amazing. There's like scaling the side of buildings in flip-flops. It was super cool. Anyway, one boy, he came one day and his head was shaved, which normally wasn't. And I reached down and I said, oh, hi. And I kind of rubbed his head, and the pack of kids just froze. I could tell I had done something wrong, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry. And he just laughed, and then they all ran off. And so I asked one of the older girls, I said, so why did everyone freeze? What did I, and she said, oh, when someone shaves their head, you can't touch their head. He said, actually, you should never touch our head, because that's where the Buddha sits. You might knock him off, right? And so very similar to what my teacher had taught me, or that was actually later that I met my teacher, that the Buddha's sitting here, the Buddha's sitting on your head. It's so intimate. You can't see it, but it's so intimate. So in this part where he says, when we seek after the Dharma, we become far from the boundary of the Dharma. Now, we shouldn't take this as an encouragement not to seek. We have to seek, if for no other reason than to study ourself, to study our longing to find the answer as something that is not intimate, something that can be an object, something that we could consume, something that we could acquire, something that we could own. If we don't exercise that part of our being that really wants that, we never find compassion for it. We never find the truth about it. It's not enough to tell ourselves, well, it's no good looking outside. I should just be content with what I have. That's not the message here, is just be content with your delusion. The message is, no, you have a jewel, like a full-on, you won the lottery at birth. The consciousness which you received is better than anything you could fathom that you would receive in this life. Any gift you could receive, any lottery you could win, anything. The consciousness that you received at birth is everything pales in comparison to that. But almost none of us appreciate that. No, we don't. It's almost impossible for us to fully appreciate what kind of jewel we've been given. So our job is to come to know that. So we have to seek because we don't know it. But the seeking has its own mistake. It's a delusion. It is the Genjo Koan of delusion. You can't grasp it. Your own desire to be able to grab onto the spiritual truth and everything, it's not a problem. But realize it's ungraspable and that it's not giving you, it's not the true thing, which is what we tend to do. And if we seek, eventually we'll tire of only looking out there. And then we have this capacity to learn to receive. And that's in the second line where he says, when the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, the person is immediately an original person. So the Dharma is transmitted to the self. Right? The self isn't going out to claim the Dharma. Now, that receiving, he calls an original person. Now, this original person, if you remember the poem I read last week from Tozan, or not the poem, the koan, where about the birds, and Tozan's always telling his students to follow the path of the birds. And one of his students says, "What is the path of the birds?" And Tozan said, "One does not encounter a single person." And the monk says, "How does one take such a path?" And Tozan said, one proceeds with no self underfoot. And the monk says, "Does this equal seeing one's original face?" That original face and this original person, is that how he says it here? Yeah, original person. These are very similar. They're like a similar expression, right? The character for original is the same. So your original face or your original person, is that what happens when we follow this path? That we can discover our original person? This thing that Okumura Roshi has translated as original person, another way you could talk about it is the original portion of a person. The original, what you have originally received as a person. That's a way you could think about it. That original face isn't something you can claim. You already have it. And that's why Tozan says, you've got it upside down. You think I'm telling you to fly through the air like a bird and follow the path of the birth so you can go find your original face. But your original face is right there on your face. You can't see it. It's not to be seen. You've got it upside down. You're not going to find it by seeing it. And so this is much the same way. When we're looking for the Dharma, we're looking for our original consciousness. We look out there and we miss it because it's so intimate. But when we're able to receive the transmission, then our original face is present. Isn't that beautiful? So then he's going to tell us something here a little bit about what is that, what's required for us to be able to do that kind of receiving. And he uses this image of the boat. And he says, if you're in a boat, you probably experienced this. If you hadn't experienced it in a boat, you might experience it in the bus. Have you ever been in the bus and then you think that you're moving, but it was the bus next to you that was moving? Or like in a train, or sometimes it's the other way around. You think that one's moving, but you're the one that's moving. And it just has to do with, your kind of your perspective and what you can see or can't see. So he's just using that as an example. So you're in a boat and you're moving along and you think that everything's passing you by. But actually, if you pay a little bit different kind of attention, you see that you're passing all of it by. Your perspective changes. You don't think that the boat is the center. There is a permanent consciousness from which I am looking. Now, how often we do that, right? You'd like walk around in the world and you think that you're stable, like your view is coming from a stable place. You might not think you're that stable, but you're pretty convinced that like when you look, that you're looking from a place that's a reliable place to look or is a fixed place to look. and you're just seeing things. But it's hard for us to consider that where I'm seeing it from is so wrapped up in the seeing. In fact, you're stitching together like this room right now. You don't see anything like this whole room ever. There's never a time you see this whole room. And yet you can sit here and experience it as if you knew that you were in this room, because your mind stitches together all these fragments of shards of perception and gives you the experience of continuity. Right? That's kind of modern neuroscience's explanation, but really Buddhists sort of keyed into that a long time ago. And so that kind of fixed quality of our own being, again, a subject in a world of objects, we very naturally fall into that. So Dogen uses this kind of an example to tell us about how it is we buy into the permanence of our own place of looking from. And then he says this interesting thing at the end. He says, when we intimately practice and return right here, it is clear that all things have no self. So this is a lot like saying, when the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, the person is immediately an original person. Now, there's a term here that comes up a lot, and it's difficult in the English because the word that we have for it is self. This is going to show up in the Japanese as a lot of different things. Sometimes it's a character ji, sometimes it's a character ga, sometimes it's, for those of you who understand Japanese, it's a phonetic ware, or what's the term we use? Yeah, it is ware. So there are different words in Japanese that get translated as self. And that's actually good, because in Japanese, it's not that they're all so clearly separable. Sometimes, when a person talks about the original language of things, it's super annoying because in the original language, there's actually 3 meanings, but you only get 1 meaning. So, you can't really understand it. That's not my point here. My point is that when they're talking about self, there's a lot of ways we could understand what self is. And that is totally true in our experience too, right? So one way we experience self in Okumura's translation here, where he says all things have no self, in that last line that I was just reading, when we intimately practice and return right here, it is clear that all things have no self. He oftentimes translates it as no fixed self. Right? He adds a fixed. And the reason he does that is because in this case, he's talking about this way of understanding self, ga, which means like your sense of a permanent self. He actually uses wade, I think, in this thing. But what he's talking about is this ga, a clinging to self, right? So sometimes when self comes up, that's what it's talking about. Other times when self comes up, it's talking about the place through which all things come through, the self that is verified by all things, right? And so it flips back and forth. That's true in our own experience of practice, right? Sometimes we're clinging to a self, or we're coming from we're looking from our own self view. Sometimes there's a self that is opening and letting all things emerge through it. We likely don't know the difference between those things. It's not because something feels good, it doesn't mean that it's realization. And if it feels bad, that it's delusion. That's not how it works exactly. So anyway, in this line here, when he says that when we intimately practice and return right here, it is clear that all things have no self. If we compare that to when the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, the person is immediately an original person. When the Dharma is correctly transmitted to the self, is a lot like this intimately practice and returning right here. So returning right here is talking about that place, that intimate place that you already are, or you already are present. And that's the place in which the receiving is possible. And the key to that place is that all things have no fixed self. That the kind of clinging we do to our own perspective, that's what keeps us from being intimate with what is already present. We hold on to the idea that it's a self, and then there has to be a bunch of objects. Because how can there be a subject without objects? There can't be. So for you to have a sense of subject, you have to create objects. And then for there to be objects, there has to be a subject. And it all comes into existence at the same time. Anybody read Slaughterhouse 5? 9? 5. Did people read that? Long time ago. You remember the ice? What was that? What was that thing? Wasn't there there was like this substance that would turn the whole world into ice? Ice 5. Yeah, Ice 5. So for those of you who read it, Ice 5. If you haven't read it, just block this out of your mind or go read it and that will make sense. But Ice 5, that's kind of like what self-clinging consciousness is. The whole universe just gets stacked up. Everything becomes frozen instantly. It gets frozen in subject-object relationship. Now, another way we could translate the same line is to say the principle that the myriad dharmas are not a me is clear. He translates it as, it is clear that all things have no self, which is a little bit more easy to understand. But listen to this. The principle that the myriad dharmas are not a me is clear. So it's not just about my own not having a self, but that all things, we may think about them as being independent entities, as being me's, but that they're not. Nothing is an independent me. And that's what it means to practice intimately, is to practice seeing that. Now, we can experience this really directly in our day-to-day life. You go around regarding things as subjects and objects. Intimacy is very difficult. True intimacy is difficult. You can get kind of close to something. But when you drop that preoccupation, then of you being a self and that being a self, something else becomes possible. And the air comes in and out of you in a mysterious way. The actual air, but also the metaphorical air. Like all of the intermixing that you do with the world is really supportive there. Okay, basic teaching here, teaching of no self, which that is also really fundamental Buddhism. I like to point that out as we go along through these things because really Dogen in some ways is just giving another expression of what are really, really fundamental teachings of Buddhism. You guys want to talk about time now? Okay, great. We've done a lot of... Thank you. So, hi. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Right. Why is that important to you? And that's why it's important to see why Dogen is not denying the world of delusion. It's so important. I think maybe anything, if there's one thing I just feel like I want to emphasize again and again and again and again, is that line where it's not that Buddhas cut off the world of delusion. Buddhas are greatly awakened to delusion. Sentient beings, otherwise known as deluded beings, are greatly deluded about awakening. And so we're right in awakening all the time. It's totally intimate. It is the very foundation of our consciousness. It is our nature. And yet we're deluded about it again and again. That's what it means to be a sentient being. Now, that very same world, it's not even a separate world. That very same world, Buddhas are enlightened to. And they're enlightened about that delusion. And so the path for us is not to get away from the delusion. The path is to become awakened to the delusion. And that becomes the way that we don't divide those two out. Because that's really the core of how we create so much suffering, is we're always trying to separate. We separate delusion, awakening. We separate life and death. We separate living beings and Buddhas. We separate self and other. All of those things that we bifurcate again and again. Yeah. One of the things we say sometimes is that a bodhisattva, or a being that is walking the Buddha way, they are in cyclic existence by choice. And the choice is a result of their vow. So they live through vow. And living through vow, they appear again and again in the world. But to them, it's not a world of delusion. It's a world of their awakening. We call it the world of delusion because we're living through our karma. We're not living through our vow of awakening. Sometimes we are. That's the path, is to live through that vow and to make a choice to live through that vow, as opposed to just being turned by our karma. And that takes a lot of work. And it's a slightly different than seeking and finding. It's transformative, right? We're transforming what is here, as opposed to, I went out and looked for it and I found it and I got the enlightenment and then all my problems went away. It was actually, I had to transform my being. Which is a lot, it's a different kind of task than looking for a treasure. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because the world system can't be separate from you at all, which we in here, when we talk about time, that's going to come out a little bit. Okay, so if we think about this basic principle, everything we've been talking about now has been laid out in space, right? We're talking about self, we're talking about other, we're talking about a subject, we're talking about an object, but we've all been talking about that in a spatial way. It's very natural for us to talk about it in a spatial way. But this next section, what Dogen's going to introduce, is the exact same principle also lays out in time, right? So if we think about the self, other, that's kind of a spatial way of thinking about it. But we do this in time too. We think the self of now and the self of later, that's in the same kind of relationship, right? Or a non-self of later, whatever it is. So if you just think about time, this, I don't know about you, but for most people, for me, this number 8 is like the wackiest, right? It's just like, whoa, what's going on? It does it kind of like this. I think one of the reasons is because we're not used to thinking about time in such a free way. If we just think about time as being like space, but it's just on a different axis, right? And one of the issues that we have with time is that our deluded relationship with time is that we really have a problem with death. And so with our problem with death, we are always reifying things in a particular way in relationship to that they will disappear. You will disappear, I will disappear, we will all disappear, we'll all die. And so we there's a kind of directionality in time for us that is different than what we experience in space, right? 'Cause in space, if this inking's right here, I can go, can't see the inking. Can see the inking. Can't see the inking. I can see the inking. And that's how I relate with things in space, right? They can come and go. But when it's time-based, a lot of things come and go in time. I saw Kai this morning, and then I got to see him again after lunch, and I saw him right before, that's my grandson, and I saw him right before meditation tonight. So he comes and goes in time. But there also come a time where I don't get to see him anymore. And that's unbelievably painful. So time is loaded in a way for us that is different than space is. But essentially, time has a very similar kind of quality to space. We occupy a certain amount of time. Like, I was born in 1970. I don't know when I'll pass away, but there will be the time dimensions of my being. Just like there's the 6'2", 250-pound shape of stuff that's right here in front of you today that has a limited, it's limited, right? It fills up a certain amount of space. And my life will also fill up a certain amount of time. So if we take the same thing that we've been studying in terms of space and we apply it to time, what kind of thing do we get? Let's talk about that a little bit, and then let's read about these ashes and the firewood. I'm pretending like I have written something that's more comprehensible than what Dogen wrote, but let's see if it's true. Okay, so we've been talking about, I don't know how well this is working for people, but I've been talking a lot about this mirror, which also sometimes I talk about as being the pupil of the eye. Sometimes I refer to it as the fountain or the well. It is the foundations of consciousness. It's where everything appears through. It is the jewel. Oh, I used another one tonight, the jewel. Is there 2 L's in jewel or 1? Just 1, okay. There should be 2 L's in jewel. I'm putting another one on there. So the thing about this is that it isn't a thing, right? It's not something that we have, like it's not an object. It is the capacity for consciousness to experience, for all things to come into being, right? Into being in terms of them, that we could experience them. That all shows up in this mirror. Now, what I said was the way that we're normally experiencing that is I got a different shape monk. So the way I experience that is like I see this thing that appears like it's outside of me. I see it inside of me. I see it in the window of my own experience. Does that, people follow that? The way when you're experiencing something, like if I look at Esho, I'm like pretty sure she's there, but I'm also aware that that experience of Esho-ness is like a reflection that's in my head, right? I know that that's how that's happening. And so it's very natural for me to think about her as being out there and for me as being in here. So in that kind of relationship, if this is happening in space, think about what that looks like when you think about it in time. So right now, if I'm thinking about myself, and then I'm looking into what I call the future, I say, oh, tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a memorial service tomorrow. I know that. So I could have all of this like perception of what this future thing that's happening. Just like I look out there and I see something, I could have, and it's all built on data points, right? Just like Esho's built on data points, otherwise known as photons of light that are going onto my retina and sending pulses to my brain, right? So I'm building her from those data points. I have data points that would help me build an idea about the future. I have data points about yesterday. What's today, Thursday? What did I do yesterday? I can't remember. I lost the data points. There was a bunch of things I did. I know there was. Oh, I drywalled at nighttime. I don't recommend that, by the way. I'm trying to get my bathroom finished before my wife gets back, and I was in there putting mud in. It was like in the half dark at like 9 o'clock. It was really stupid. Anyway, so I have that. I have that past me, right? That's there. So I can do the same thing with the past and the future that I do when we're relating in this way. Now, what I mean by that is this mirror. Remember before I said that the mirror doesn't actually have an edge and that we're all the reflection of that mirror? We're all like coated in silver. We're like silver jumpsuit people. And we're all just totally reflecting. Well, that boundless quality of the mirror, which is what makes it a mirror, is also boundless in time in the same way that it's boundless in space. What that means is that when we talk about the experience of the present moment, that is not cut off from what we think about as the future and the past. The future and the past are totally involved in there being a present. In the same way that all of the things that are around you are totally involved in you being in a place at one time. Your position as a self that is, dependent on all of these things in this moment of time, that stretches out through time as well. So all the future selves and all the past selves, all the future things that you encounter, all the past things you encounter, all of that is involved in the self that you are right now. The myriad dharmas or all dharmas are not just laid out in space. They're also laid out in time. So that's challenging because if you tried to think about like all the dharmas that are just in space, that's like a whole bunch, right? Like the what's the new telescope? James Webb. Yeah, I mean that's even crazier than the Hubble telescope, right? And you see that stuff, and you're just like all the droopy galaxies, and everything. And those are just, so that's space. Now, say like that space goes in each direction in a way we don't, time-wise, beyond what we could know. And you know what the scientists have been saying now? They said, we think that maybe the Big Bang wasn't the beginning. Duh. That's happened over and over and over again. Which, if you had read the Upanishads, you would have already known that. But the point the point there is, if we think about all of those things being involved, that's totally ungraspable. And part of what Dogen Zenji is trying to get us to see is that the ungraspability is not just in the vastness of everything, but the ungraspability is in the specific thing, like yourself. You are totally ungraspable. You could look, as much as you could look out into the sky to try to see something and have just galaxy upon galaxy upon galaxy, you could do the same thing looking inside. And it's just galaxy upon galaxy upon galaxy upon galaxy. And you can't find a solid place, right? You just see the ungraspable vastness as it expands. Now that is an invitation. that ungraspability. It's an invitation not to simply lock back into the kind of relationships in space that we have, subject-object, but also not to lock into the same relationships we have around in time. And to see what is the truth of a thing in its relationship in time. Now, what Dogen does to try to talk about that is he uses this example of firewood and ash and life and death. So, actually, I don't think I need to write that down. So, he says firewood is firewood. It has its own future, it has its own past, has its own present. It has a whole life of firewoodness. Everything in the universe, through all time and all space, is involved in that firewood being firewood. If that's true, that firewood has what is called in Buddhism its own Dharma position. What a Dharma position means is just as it is just exactly what it is and nothing else. And that is true. It just is exactly what it is. But the only reason it can be just exactly what it is because it is not in opposition to anything throughout space or time. That's why Dogen says it has its own past, it has its own future. Right? In this line where he says, we should know that firewood dwells in the Dharma position of firewood, and it has its own before and after. Although there is before and after, past and future are cut off. So it has all of its before and after, but there isn't this past and future. There's not like what was the firewood before it was firewood, and what will the firewood be after it's firewood. That's not the point. It's in its own Dharma position. It just simply is totally and completely what it is. It is firewood. Right? And ash is just ash. It's totally and completely ash. And there's a whole world of the firewood. And there's a whole world of the world of the ash. And they just are simply what they are. And that's why he can say that firewood never becomes firewood again. Okay? And ash, because ash can never turn back into firewood. It just simply is what it is in its place and time. Now, I think the reason that he brings this up and why it's so important for us to pay attention to it is, again, because the challenge that we have about thinking that life turns into death. And these are kind of mysterious phrasing that he uses here, where he says, it is the never-changed tradition not to say that life becomes death. Therefore, we call it no arising. It is the laid-down way of Buddhists turning the Dharma wheel not to say that death becomes life. Therefore, we call it no perishing. Life is a position at one time. Death is also a position at one time. Right? Now, these words sound strange to us because in our normal experience, life does turn into death, right? That's how we would think about it. Life turns into death. But he's saying, no, that's delusion. Life is just simply life. There is no life that turns into death because there's no permanent thing which is traveling through that we could say transforms from life to death. There is just life is just life, and death is just death. There's no turning. But because we are so upset about death, we try to separate the two, life and death, and then one has to turn into the other. And then we have questions about like reincarnation, and we say, oh, well, then death has to turn into life. And we lay everything out in that kind of objectified way. Now, I want to give you a slightly different translation of that part of the text, because I think the way that Okumura Roshi translates it makes it more comprehensible and less comprehensible at the same time. So here are the 3 lines. I didn't write the whole thing. I didn't write the whole thing up there. I just wrote the part that was translated a little bit different. So rather than saying, not to say that life becomes death, therefore we call it non-birth. He says not to say that it becomes the death of life. This is a more literal translation. So he says we don't say that there is a death of life. There's just life. Life can't die. Life is just life. And because that's the case, we call it non-birth. We call it things don't get born. They don't come from somewhere and go to somewhere. They just simply are. They simply genjo. They simply appear as the dynamic actuality of right nowness. They didn't come from anywhere. They just are. They're not born. This is a little trick in Japanese because the no birth and the life is this birth and life are the same character. Sometimes it gets translated as a noun, sometimes it gets translated as a verb. Okay? So leave the non-birth for a second and just think about this part. It's not the death of life. Rather than saying life doesn't turn into death, just say that we can't talk about the death of life. And in the same way, we don't want to talk about the life of death or the being born of death. If we bring that down to the spring and the summer, then I think this starts to make more sense. Because every time I read that, I'm like, spring does too turn into summer. That's what I think. But what he's referring here to is the no self. He's saying there's no thing called spring. Right? If we're going to talk about spring as a thing, that spring is its own dharma position that has its own before and after. The whole universe is expressed as that spring. There isn't like a little bubble of springness that's moving through time and then transforms into summer. There is only spring. Spring is just spring. And then there's summer, that's just summer. So in that case, we say we don't think that it is the winter of spring. We don't think spring has a winter. You see that language that is different? We don't think that spring has a winter. That's different than saying spring doesn't turn into summer, or spring doesn't turn into winter, or winter doesn't turn into spring. So they are separate things. The seasons are their own things. And so that's what he's trying to emphasize there. Mm-hmm.
But you can't have death without life.
Right.
You can't have ash without fire.
Exactly. It's totally included. So when we say it from the side of firewood, ash is totally included. Just like all the beings and all the everything is included in the firewood, is showing up as firewood. But the firewood isn't related to ash. Like the firewood is not now and then the ash is later. The firewood is just firewood and the ash is already present in the firewoodness of it. That's the side that he's expressing right now. It's super related to when he says one side is illuminated, the other side is dark. So he's saying, you see the firewood that's illuminated, the ash disappears because it's included in the firewood. The firewood can't be there if the ash wasn't included, because everything's included in the firewood at that point. So this changes our perspective about things from moving to always trying to explain this phenomena as being like the unfolding of these causes and effects from before, and going to these causes and effects that are going to go, to saying that there's an immediate reality to things. Why is this so important? There's a couple reasons I think it's so important. One is because it helps us to focus on Dogen's central message here, which is that everything is spiritually significant. It's not spiritually significant later. It wasn't that it was spiritually significant and now it's not spiritually significant. It's that everything in front of you at this time includes everything. So you have to treat it that way. You don't treat it that way later. It wasn't that you treated it that way before, so you treat it that way before, so you don't need to treat it that way now. That is continuous, or continuous isn't even the right word. It is the actuality of what's present right now. So I think that's one reason that it's important. I think another reason that it's important is in a very fundamental level of our delusion, we are splitting apart life and death. And even to say that life and death are both necessary and that they lead into each other, life leads to death and death leads to life, even to say that, there is a way in which we're kind of pulling the two apart. And we want to pull the two apart because life and death are so fundamentally painful that the appearance and disappearance of our self and the selves of others is so fundamentally challenging to us that this is an invitation into seeing things in a different way. Not sure if we're a little over time. I'm going to go ahead and share this. I'm kind of going back and forth on it because I bring up our daughter Satsuki a lot, and I'm really fine talking about it. And it's a hard thing. And so I don't want to exploit it, so that's why sometimes I'm hesitant to bring it up. But she died when she was 18. And one of the things that's so difficult in encountering that kind of young death is, her life could have been long. All the things that could have, she could have been here now. She could have been playing with Kai. She could have been in our life. And so there's this wall you come up against in that kind of loss where you're just completely crushed. But one of the medicines that was there was that I also had cancer when I was her age. I survived. I had lymphoma. She had leukemia. But what I remember was, I said to my mother, I said, "It's okay if I die, Mom." And I don't, looking back on it, I don't know why I said that. But after Satsuki died, I kind of knew. It was like our life, the time you live is your time of living. And, there may be things, if you thought about it, like, I'm sure when my time comes that I'll think like, oh, I want to see my kids a little longer. I want to see the temple flourish a little longer. I want to see this project happen. That will be the case at any time when it's your time to die. But that you lived the life that is yours to live. And whether that's long or short, my wife's only 4'10". I don't think that she's like diminished because she occupies less space and I occupy more space. In fact, I'm trying to occupy slightly less space by losing a little weight. But time is really the same way. But because it's so challenging in a way that space isn't always challenging, sometimes it is. We're separated from people we care about, just spatially, not in time. That we get so caught up in that. But when we can see that, like, no, actually, our time to live is our time to live. And that has its own boundaries. And it is its own life, not related to death. The death is already present there in that living. Then there's a different way that we can perceive the world of how it is that we that we come and go. It's not the tragedy of life turning into death. That's one way that we experience it, and that's crushing. But if that's all there is, then I mean, in my case, I wouldn't have survived if that's all there was. There's another way in which the life is just the life, and that way, then there's great sorrow, but there's also great celebration that is present. I'll ask Satsuki tonight if she's sick of me using her as an example. We talk each evening before bed. So next week, 9 and 10. So we'll talk about the moon and the water. Oh, this is just going to be so romantic. Yeah, and oceans. Oh gosh, can we really get through 9 and 10? I bet we won't get through 9 and 10. I bet you we will get through 9 and we will briefly talk about 10, but try to get those in you. 10 is actually my favorite, with the sea, the going out into the sea on a boat. And can anyone play the Lyle Lovett song, If I Had a Boat? Maybe someone bring their guitar and sing that for us. But, did you guys ever listen to that song? Oh my gosh, that. Anybody tells you they don't like country music, you just spool up the Lyle Lovett. All right, sorry for keeping you a little bit late tonight. Tadiyambi Sangha